Everybody, welcome to today's Kubernetes Clinic. It's tips we learned from achieving SOC 2 compliance applied to Kubernetes. Today's session is going to be in listen-only mode. If you do have a question, please submit it through the Q&A tab in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We'll queue them up and answer them either as we go or at the end. I'd like to introduce our two speakers today. We have Joe Pelletier, who's the VP of Product Strategy, and Andy Suderman, who is the Director of R&D and Technology. Andy and Joe, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Dave. Looking forward to today's presentation on SOC 2 and what we learned at Fairwinds, as well as how it can be applied to Kubernetes. Like Dave said, I'm the VP of Product over here at Fairwinds, and Andy Suderman is also our Director of R&D and Technology. I think we're going to go ahead and just kind of kick it off today and talk a little bit about what is SOC 2, right? I think this is a term, if you're in the operations or security space, or even do this as a full-time job, it's a big part and big cross-functional effort that lots of businesses have to go through. And at a really high level, right, I think companies use SOC 2 reports to really prove to internal as well as external stakeholders that they're securing data and customer privacy according to best practices, right? And there's many business benefits for SOC 2. In our experience, we hear a lot of customers who are maybe in their growth stage, smaller companies who are growing fast, as well as even kind of medium and larger companies who have to go through this on an annual basis, talk about the needs and pains around SOC 2. And really, SOC 2 reports can be used to help drive and win new business, for software firms who are, processing and holding on to customer data, right? You want to be able to show to your customers and your partners that you are aligned with best practices. And so, SOC 2 can be a powerful report for that. At a very high level, SOC 2 brings together 5 different trust principles. We won't go through every single one, but at a very high level, there's security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, as well as privacy. And I think a lot of times folks, when they think about SOC 2, they kind of immediately gravitate towards security, but it's also really important to make sure that the best practices and the standards that your organization are following are also mindful of availability and confidentiality and privacy of data, right? So at the end of the day, it's not all just about, while security is a big part of it, it's also a lot more robust around being able to assess your internal controls, as well as the things that matter to affecting customer trust. I found this great graphic online when I was putting together this presentation. I thought I did a great job kind of articulating what are the different types of SOC reports as well. Today, we're talking a lot about SOC 2, but in reality, there's actually three different types of SOC reports. And when we started our journey, we went through SOC 1. We had to understand and make sure we leveraged our finance and HR teams to make sure we're having internal controls over our financial reporting, right? And a lot of this is sort of like the basic starting point for lots of folks who are getting into SOC compliance. But you quickly move to SOC 2, which looks at a more broader set of requirements, everything that maps into that trust principle. And there's really kind of 2 types of SOC 2. So when we talk about SOC 2, we're talking about first type 1 and type 2. What type 1 does is really assesses from a design standpoint all of the controls that you are relevant for your organization, and making sure that they are implemented in the correct way. And what type 2 does is then creates a 6-month period to monitor that those processes are being followed correctly. And Andy, I think when he gets to his part of this presentation, we'll talk a lot about his experience going through type 1 and more recently type 2, and some of the things that we learned along the way. And a lot of the lessons that we've learned can be applied generically, not just to Kubernetes, but just to any organization going through SOC 2. And in the process, we also learned a lot about things that do affect Kubernetes, which we'll go into some details around as well. I think the other thing you'll find is with SOC 2, a lot of organizations are kind of pursuing this this path right here, because it does produce a report that you can share with customers and vendors and partners under NDA that has management's attestation to the implementation of the different controls. SOC 3 kind of goes to the next level and can make that a publicly available document. But a lot of organizations, I believe, are pursue SOC 2 because of the fact that you can just share it under NDA. The other thing to be aware of too is when it comes to who's involved in SOC 2, it's actually lots of departments. It's 100% a cross-functional effort, and the common criteria, which is what you're going to see as sort of the requirements within SOC 2, involve different departments as you go along. And this was somewhat, for me, who I'm actually fairly new to. This is my first time going through the process myself. A lot of times you think it is something that just security and operations might be responsible for, but it really is a whole company effort. And I think a lot of the lessons around how you can achieve compliance and use this as a way to grow your business, you'll hear about some of that in our presentation. But as you can see, there are 9 different common criteria areas, and while operations is involved in a lot of them, you'll see that there's definitely roles for HR, upper management, and the development teams as well. Another thing to highlight when it comes to SOC 2 is you'll see this concept of control criteria as well as focus areas. So in the previous slide, I talked about the 9 different sections. Those are different kind of control criteria, or common criteria rather. And within the common criteria, there are specific focus areas. So we're going to highlight different focus areas that we have found relevant for Kubernetes when we've gone through our own scenarios. And it'll just help you understand sort of how the guidance is broken down, starting at that common criteria, breaking it down to different focus areas. So just a little bit of a construct in terms of how this information is presented and how the criteria is being presented, when you go through this process. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Andy to give us a little bit of a walkthrough of what we've learned achieving SOC 2 compliance at Fairwinds.
Thanks, Joe. That was a really great overview. I wish somebody had given me that before we started down our initial SOC 2 compliance journey, in which I have learned a ton. So thanks for that. So I'm just going to talk about 5 different kind of things that if I had known beforehand, or things that we learned through the process that are important to the process of achieving SOC 2 Type 2 compliance. So the first one is about ownership. One of the very, very first things you're going to have to do when you get into this process is to take a look at all the things you use. So all the different systems. And if you're like us, you're a startup building software, you're probably using a lot of vendors. You probably have, like a GitHub or a GitLab for VCS. You probably have something running your pager. You probably have a monitoring solution. You probably have an HR system. You probably have a knowledge base or somewhere where you're keeping documentation. You probably have, what if you're like us, you have 24 potentially different vendors. And if you grew those organically, you started adding them over time, there's somebody in the organization who owns each one of those systems. And it's probably, several different people across the organization that own these different systems. And so the first thing is to just really sit down and have a list of, these are all the systems we use. These are all the people who have admin control over those, who are responsible for those and administer those systems. And that group of people is sort of your initial compliance team. And it may be really big. It may be like everyone in your organization, depending on where you're at. And so this may be a time where you need to sit down and consolidate some of these. Maybe somebody needs to be responsible for a grouping of these systems. And so really, truly walk through and understand who all these people are, what they're responsible for, and what all the systems are. And then part of SOC 2 is you're going to have to go and categorize all these systems. What's in them? What kind of data is in these systems? Is it confidential just to you? Is it something where you keep customer data? And start to classify those different categories. So that's kind of the first step really in this whole journey. We can move on to the next one. One of the things I learned going through SOC 2, coming from an engineering background and ops background, compliance was always a little bit of a dirty word to me. It was always, well, you're just checking boxes to satisfy requirements. You're not really doing anything better. And I used to think that was true. And I've really come to learn that it's not so much about that. It's about really ensuring that you're following those best practices that you should be following, and then proving that you're following them and actually having a process in place for them. So you're probably doing a lot of these things already, these best practices and things that we should all be doing in our environments, in our architecture, and in our systems administration. But you may not be doing it everywhere. You may have gaps that you're not aware of. You may have things that you've forgotten to do. And so really continuing to follow those, but starting to button them down and keep track of what you're supposed to be doing in those areas. So some of the key ones that really take up a good portion of the time, authentication or single sign-on. So making sure that everything that you possibly can is integrated with your single sign-on, whether that's a Google SAML authentication or using an identity provider such as Okta or one of the many others out there, and really making sure that all those systems that you identified in step one are hooked up to that system. Some more best practices that we were doing, but had to really verify and button down, encrypting all of our data stores. So, when I set up an RDS instance or something like that, for example, I automatically turn on encryption for it, but it is an option that you have to turn on. And so go through and verify that you're encrypting all of those data stores, your EBS volumes, your S3 buckets, and things like that. Another one is TLS encryption across all of your public endpoints and as many internal endpoints as possible, and making sure that you're using, good cipher suites and strong TLS protocols. And then another one in the realm of system access, like I talked about a minute ago. Are you reviewing who has access to all those systems? Are you looking at that on a periodic basis and saying, oh, so-and-so doesn't really need access to this. Can we revoke this? Or have we offboarded all the people that have left the company since the beginning from all of these systems? Or is the list up to date? And keeping track of that. And then back to your application deployments, talking about reliability. Do you have a highly available setup? If you're in Kubernetes, hopefully you do. It should make that fairly easy. But can you draw out a picture of your architecture that shows your potential failure points? And do you understand those? Do you have a strategy for disaster recovery? If an entire AWS region goes down or entire region of your cloud provider, do you have a strategy to get your architecture back up and running, your whole system back up and running? Or maybe that's not the focus of your business. Maybe your business can survive through that outage and you don't need to worry about that. Do you have that decision documented? Do you understand why you made that decision? And then I'll talk about this a little bit more in a later slide, but do you have a deployment like a process by which you verify the code that is making it into production? Do you have change management? Are you doing pull requests? Are you running checks? So really just think about all those different best practices and that make sure that you're doing them everywhere consistently and that you have the decisions documented that say, this is why we're doing that.
That's great advice, Andy.
Thanks. So we'll go on to the next slide. This is kind of in the vein of best practices, something you should be doing, but something that we were already doing and added a little bit more through this process as well, is security scanning. And not just like your generic, like I click a button and get a scan and see a list of endpoints, but at different levels, are you scanning the security configuration and posture of your application? So, our Fairwinds Insights tool allows you to run various scans for configuration, for vulnerability checking, and things like that at the CI/CD level and at the in-cluster level. But then there's another level on top of that, your entire cloud environment, around your Kubernetes cluster and around your, whatever you're deploying your code into. What are you doing for security at that level? This is something that we actually ended up having to implement as part of the process because we didn't have anything in place because we hadn't thought through that at that point. And so we ended up, configuring and enabling AWS Guard Duty because it was relatively straightforward and not super noisy. But just make sure you've thought through that level of scanning at every level, from your code to your what's deployed in your cluster to your entire cloud infrastructure. All
Skip this
right.
section.
Number 4. I hinted at this a little bit, but I'll go a little bit more in depth here. Your development and deployment process. And this is going to be a good chunk of your SOC 2 controls. And probably the biggest one that's going to apply specifically to your development teams and your development process. So do you have a documented process for how code gets into production from beginning to end? So I, as a developer, make a pull request. Does that pull request get reviewed? How does it get reviewed? Who's allowed to approve it? How many approvals does it need? What checks are we running as part of it? Are we running our security scans at this level? Do they have to pass for me to get that code into production, or are we just ignoring them because they're noisy and we don't like them? And so really make sure that that process is documented and enforced. And this is where the tricky part gets in, because you don't just have to enforce it, but you have to enforce it for everyone. There's always going to be an admin that has the ability to merge code without following the process. And so the next piece of it is to start to get visibility into your ability to audit changes and your ability to cover up that audit trail as well. So I, as the administrator, can I make a change, push it all the way into production, and then essentially make that change go away like it never happened? And you shouldn't be able to do that. And so what checks do you have in place that prevent that? One thing we ended up implementing was a system that monitors our production cluster and just drops a notification that says a change was made to this cluster into a specific Slack channel. But the way that notification system is managed is separate from our development workflow. And so nobody can make a change in production without a separate notification being generated. And so we have that audit trail to show the full continuity of our product from beginning to end. And that's a tricky one that you don't normally think about when you first get into, deploying code into production. You don't think about like, oh, well, our principal architect can push code all the way into production and nobody would know it. And you may not think that's a bad thing at the beginning, but part of your compliance with SOC 2 is to show that no one person has the ability to do that sort of change across your entire infrastructure.
And Andy, does Git play a big role in terms of the auditability so that you can track those changes here?
Huge. I don't see how you could satisfy a lot of these requirements without some sort of version control system. Git being obviously the one of choice for most development teams. Yeah. It really, that workflow, not just Git itself, but also wherever you're storing your code, whether it's GitLab or GitHub, that ability to create that process around your Git commits and pull requests or merge requests. Really, it makes that a lot easier because you can just, show, hey, we have this process. It's implemented in our repository. These are the enforcing mechanisms that are there.
And it feels like the development and deployment process is very closely tied with your previous slide around security scanning, right? And you need to have both of those need to work together in order to develop, a system that achieves compliance and is following best practices. When it comes to the security scanning, I think a lot of folks think about scanning code, which is really important, right? But how have we had to think about the infrastructure as code and the containers that we're also using in our environment? Is that part of the same kind of scanning regimen that you've implemented as part of our process?
Definitely. Something, we don't just deploy our application to our clusters, we deploy add-ons to our clusters. And we have to be able to check those for security configurations and known vulnerabilities in the containers. And then just doing it at the code level is not enough because you have to be able to, monitor that over time. I might deploy a container into my cluster and it might sit there for 6 months without the version changing, but a CVE could be released that affects that container after we've deployed it. And so running simultaneously that CI/CD and the in-cluster checking. And we use Insights to do all of that, and it satisfied all of our requirements. And actually, it's not a requirement that we do all of that as part of SOC 2. We made that our internal policy to make sure that we were, checking all of our boxes that we want. But really the requirement is that you do some sort of scanning and that you can show that you're doing it over time. And so really, even just that in-cluster piece could satisfy the requirement for SOC 2. We just decided to also implement it as part of our check process.
Gotcha. And is that just one of the policies that you've implemented? Are there other types of policies and procedures that had to be added or modified to support SOC 2?
Oh yeah, all sorts of them. So, my slides have focused primarily on application deployment, development, and infrastructure, because that's where my, my responsibilities lie mostly. But across the organization, we had things, related to HR and related to taking on vendors. We now have a vendor policy that requires us to evaluate the risk of taking on that vendor. And, this is where SOC 2 starts to spread out, because if they can send us a SOC 2 type 2 report, then we can, validate them as a vendor because they've gone through this process as well. We know they're meeting this, set of criteria. And so that, leads nicely, thank you, Joe, into this next slide, which is really the true meat of the SOC 2 compliance effort is documenting all of these policies, not just your infrastructure policies, not just your security policies, but your HR policies. How are people onboarded and offboarded? How do you take on vendors? How do you evaluate risk for the company? What larger risks does the company have at the whole company level? And writing all that down and then being able to show that you're following that. And this is where the tricky part comes in, because it's one thing to write a policy, but it's another to prove that you're following the policy.
And that's the type 2 part that we were talking about, right? Like the 6-month period of evaluation. Okay.
Right. So yeah, type 1, you've written all the policies. You say you have the policies. And type 2, you go through an observation period where an auditor comes in and looks at all the evidence that you generate over this time. And then they check specific things. So like related to our CI/CD process, we would send them a list of changes that were deployed within that 6-month period. And they would say, okay, give me all the evidence for that one, and that one. And so we'd have to show that we followed our documented policy and process for all of those changes in that period. As far as we have onboarding and offboarding checklists for when we bring on an employee and when an employee leaves. And we had to supply all of those for that 6-month period, showing that we followed them and we did all the things that we said we were doing. And so really the evidence gathering and the documentation becomes the biggest piece of the compliance journey. And in our case, we ended up partnering with a third party, which was absolutely the right decision. They made this whole thing easier. They had, great customer success that helped us through the process, as well as having software. We partnered with a company called Content, and they have software that enabled us to, document all of our systems and our policies, and then upload the evidence that we were following those policies and procedures straight into their platform. And then the auditor gets access to the platform. And so that's our interaction with the auditor, is through that platform where we're tracking our entire compliance picture in one place.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I can see how that makes sense, especially because there's so many different pieces. And we talked about that collaboration across departments as well, having that sort of that single pane of glass.
Yeah, we have 5 or 6 people who have access to that platform, and they're able to manage their piece of the compliance picture within it, which is super nice.
That's great. I think that's a great overview of sort of how you've had to, take the requirements of SOC 2 and figure out what's relevant to Fairwinds, and then work through that type 1 process of designing the policies, and then, making sure that during that whole evaluation and monitoring period that the policies were being, properly enforced. And I think what we've realized along that journey is that Kubernetes does have some considerations within SOC 2. Kubernetes is obviously kind of a newer architectural paradigm, and a lot of times we get questions of how does SOC 2 affect Kubernetes, right? And we wanted to really kind of take a step back and try to understand how can we help our customers understand what parts of Kubernetes are relevant for their organization within the scope of SOC 2. And we wanted to figure out with our existing product, we have a product called Fairwinds Insights, which I'll talk to in a little bit. How can we help those customers narrow in and decide on what criteria, again, is relevant to them? So our solution for this was we're actually getting ready to release what we call a compliance self-assessment tool. And it's going to help guide our customers on the best way to meet the criteria that's relevant for their organizations in terms of how they use Kubernetes today. And as folks go through those different requirements, there's ways where Fairwinds can help either provide manual or automated evidence collection. And so that's some of the approaches that we've taken to helping customers narrow in on what's most important. Before we get into those examples, I wanted to share a little bit about Fairwinds Insights, which is our software as a service platform for Kubernetes governance and security. And like Andy mentioned, we do focus a lot on security and compliance, and we help create these policies and guardrails that allow developers to align to those policies and procedures that you need to create for SOC 2. But we also help with areas like cost optimization when companies grow their Kubernetes usage and want to be able to report as well as optimize their costs. Some of the areas that we integrate into is we kind of integrate as early as the Git and CI/CD process where code is being checked in and analyzed. We can analyze containers and infrastructure as code, which are, to Andy's earlier point, security scanning and your development process is actually a big part of achieving compliance. So there are ways Fairwinds Insights out of the box can help you, implement kind of controls around that. But we go all the way through into the production environment in the running Kubernetes cluster and can provide visibility into misconfigurations, container risk, as well as any sort of guardrails or policies that you're using to guide developers in terms of how they deploy their applications into Kube. We have multiple integration points as well. We've actually most recently announced an integration with PagerDuty, which I unfortunately don't have here, but we have integrations with Jira, Datadog, and Slack, and CircleCI, and major development platforms as well. So let's kind of jump into a couple examples here, right? When you go to look at some of the control or common criteria for SOC 2, there's language around being able to implement monitors in your system to help find anomalies around malicious acts or being able to identify errors. And when it comes to Kubernetes, there's actually some great open source out there that helps with this. And one of those tools is actually a tool called Falco. It's a CNCF. I believe it's an incubation project right now. I would have to double check, but it's sponsored by the CNCF. And it's a tool that actually analyzes your containers in the runtime in Kubernetes for any sort of unusual types of events. And this is a tool that can help you align to different common criteria, specifically focus areas like being able to filter and analyze for anomalies. So that's one way we've been able to look at our own Kubernetes infrastructure and be able to kind of align ourselves closer with requirements for our scenario by leveraging tools like Falco. And Falco is actually one of the tools that we're releasing as part of Fairwinds Insights, our software platform that I just mentioned. And so I'll give you kind of a brief example of what that might look like in a bit. There's other scenarios too, like infrastructure as code, where this is a broad kind of common criteria, but being able to test your changes as part of the development process. Now, obviously, that could mean a lot of things. It could mean just doing quality assurance. It could mean doing code security scanning on the changes that you make. But increasingly in the cloud native world, infrastructure as code with tools like Terraform or Helm or just writing YAML is increasingly part of the process of being able to release changes to your infrastructure. So with Fairwinds Insights, our tool, we actually can test Helm and YAML files related to your Kubernetes infrastructure as early as the CI/CD process, so that you can detect any sort of misconfigurations that are being introduced as part of that change, and even block those changes from being deployed. So that's one way to be able to help meet that requirement for those changes around your infrastructure that are now being managed sort of in an as code type way. a couple, in a very similar vein here, container vulnerability scanning is actually a very similar type of need, right? So the way that Common Criteria 7.1 is read is you really need to be able to identify changes to configuration that introduce any new vulnerabilities. And container images are all kind of configured as an image file, right? Like they're constructed with different layers, and it's all code at the end of the day, if you think about it. And so being able to conduct vulnerability scans as container images change is one way you can help demonstrate that in addition to any sort of code scanning you might be doing, your containers are also being tested before they're released. Again, our software Farron's Insights can integrate into the CI/CD workflow to test your containers or container images, or can even run in the runtime. So as your containers are running in production, if a new CVE is announced, you'll be able to find out about that in your cluster as well. Role-based access control is a big part of sort of the security part of that SOC 2 trust criteria or trust principle rather. And so, being able to, in general, have a process for, monitoring who has access to what is, a key aspect of maintaining SOC 2. I think Andy talked a lot about, even having audit trails there as well. You'll see that one of the focus criteria for Common Criteria 6.3 is actually using role-based access control. And this is sort of a first-class feature of Kubernetes itself. Knowing whether or not a user is following at least, you want to be able to have a process where you can monitor the RBAC profiles in Kubernetes. So you can see which of your users might have, elevated permissions and make sure that they're following the principle of least privilege, which is another kind of, requirement here in 6.3. And what Farron's Insights does is actually on a recurring basis reports out the different RBAC profiles that are configured in your cluster. So you can, and we'll flag the ones that are risky. So these are profiles that might have elevated permissions. And that gives you a way to focus on which of the profiles do I need to make sure are appropriately configured so that I'm not accidentally giving certain users too much access. So this is sort of a cornerstone of SOC 2 and also something that overlaps significantly with a core Kubernetes feature. And with Farron's Insights, we can provide that visibility for easy review. Finally, there are requirements around being able to detect any sort of unauthorized changes to the software configuration parameters. I think there's a number of different ways you could actually achieve this, right? One of the things that Farron's Insights can do is actually monitor your container images to understand what base image is being used and recommend in the if you need to be upgrading to a newer base image to reduce vulnerabilities. As part of that process, it's important to just kind of understand are new vulnerabilities being introduced, and how can I make sure that I'm maintaining the base image that is most relevant for my container image. And in general, using a process like Git as well can also provide sort of the auditability. So we just went through a few different areas around the common criteria of SOC 2 that might be in scope for your organization, and ways that our software Farron's Insights can align to that. There's actually several other different use cases for Farron's Insights, like being able to get proactive alerts on when there are configuration changes that are made and might deviate from your guardrails or your policies. Automatically creating tickets to the right teams when there's work that needs to be done on fixing their workloads. And even just being able to set the right resource requests and limits. And so what I'll do now is just give you a quick, brief overview of the Farron's Insights software. And if you can see here, we're actually on the sort of the landing page for our demo account. And what you'll, at a very high level, the first thing you're going to see is just sort of an overall health score to get a sense of how well am I trending over time, right? How many things have I fixed over time, and how many new issues have been introduced recently. You'll see that this cluster is very similar, I guess, to a lot of clusters that we see out there. There's usually container images with vulnerabilities that need to be reviewed. And from our experience, there is never a scenario where your container images are always 100% free of vulnerabilities. So that's a very common, kind of action item to review. But there's also configuration issues where some of our image pull policies are not set to always. And this is just a general best practice that a lot of teams can quickly make a change to align with the best practices and improve the reliability of their infrastructure. So what we do with Fairwinds Insights is make it easy to review these different recommendations. And if I'm concerned today about security, and I want to understand what my most critical items are, I can see here that I've got a variety of different types of workloads being affected and different types of issues. And so if I kind of jump into one of these, I'll see that I have a Jenkins application deployed in this cluster, and we have a few different critical and high severity issues that are warranting my attention. And so a lot of times when we find these types of issues, our recommendations actually upgrade to the next version of that container image. And what you'll see is in some of these cases, we're able to detect that container base image so that you can go and look for the newer version and upgrade to that version to remediate issues. So that's one area where Fairwinds Insights provides sort of ongoing visibility into the risks in your container images, but you can also use this to help achieve certain compliance requirements as well. Several of the other compliance requirements talked about being able to integrate into the CI/CD process. And so I'm going to go ahead and show an example here where we've got one of our developers checking in a change into their Git repo. And we'll see that this developer has accidentally introduced a lot of security violations, right? And so as part of our SOC 2, we want to make sure we have a process to test those changes. So we've set up guardrails using Fairwinds Insights that have actually failed this build. You can see that we've got a red X here. And when we go ahead and click into the details of that, we'll see that we have a better understanding of what's actually caused that violation. In this case, this container image is being configured to run as a privilege mode. And for us, that's a non-starter. Will fail pipelines whenever we see a high or critical issue. And so that's given some feedback directly to the developer to make sure that our development process is following best practices and also being aligned with security. The other final thing I'll share is we talked about governance, and being able to implement governance means also being able to implement policies and guardrails around your different deployments. And so you can see here, we've got several different deployments in this cluster over the past day. Some of them have passed, some of them have failed. And the reason why we're seeing this pass and failure pattern is because as our development team's deploying, we're analyzing every deployment to make sure that it's aligned to the best practice. Securing the development process is a big part of SOC 2. So we're rejecting certain applications into the cluster that don't meet our minimum requirements. And these are controls that can easily be activated as part of using Fairwinds Insights. The final thing I'll share here is RBAC. So that was the example I talked about earlier, where it's important to review your RBAC profiles and make sure that only certain folks are given the appropriate level of access. What we do with Fairwinds Insights is highlight those roles that have elevated permissions, like can viewing secrets, or they can even escalate their own permissions. And you'll see that flag here in red. And these are just kind of great examples of, making sure that certain, profiles, whether they're system or user profiles, are appropriately configured, because you want to align to that principle of least privilege. So just a couple examples of how Fairwinds Insights can align with, your SOC 2 requirements, but also do a lot more around just kind of securing your development process as well. With that said, I'm going to turn it back over to Dave to kind of kick off our polling question today.
Sure, give me 1 second here and I'll go ahead and launch the poll. And the question is, what is the greatest opportunity to improve your Kubernetes environment? We've got getting help with the basics, general best practice assessment, improving the security posture of your clusters, saving money, and improving the reliability of apps running in Kubernetes. So if everybody could just take a second and help us with the poll. I'll leave it open for another 10 seconds. Okay, so it looks like 50% of responders said improving the security posture of clusters, 25% is general best practice assessment, and 25% is saving money.
Awesome. Well, it kind of makes sense that we have folks who are interested in best practices and security on this webinar, given the focus on SOC 2. I think there's the cool thing is we shared some of our commercial software. There's also a great open source community, some of which, Fairwinds also builds tools like Polaris in our, which you can find in our GitHub repository, which will help with that best practice assessment as well. So there are some great open source starting points, as well as some robust commercial options for anyone who's thinking about securing their Kubernetes infrastructure or their development process today. And so with that said, we do have a couple, things to share with you. We also have a benchmark report, which goes through actually hundreds of different organizations that are using Fairwinds Insights today, and gives a readout on where we're seeing sort of the evolution of best practices within the Kubernetes community. So we'll be able to, in this report, we actually profile companies where they may, be aligning with best practices really well. And so that might mean doing things like not running your containers as root or in privilege mode, as well as the prevalence of organizations that may still be missing out on certain, quick wins, like being able to implement liveness probes and readiness probes. We also have a free trial if you're interested in learning more about Fairwinds Insights, the software I demoed to you earlier. So lots of great content here. I'm actually really excited about the benchmark report because it's something we just launched last month, and we're getting lots of great feedback on that. But with that said, I'll turn it over to you, Dave, if there's any questions from the audience that we want to introduce here.
Sure. So just a reminder, if you do have a question, submit it through the Q&A tab, which is in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. I do have one question that was queued up, and the person is asking if Insights could generate an actual compliance report.
Yeah, so we talked about our vision for the product and creating that self-assessment. The good news is that is something that we're planning to release in the next couple releases. So that should be something to stay tuned for. And if you're looking at wanting to get a demo of that, we definitely encourage you to sign up for the trial here, and we'll be able to demo that capability. So short answer is yes, and you'll be able to kind of start interacting with it very soon.
Okay. Looks like there's one more question here. Will this be applicable to other compliance frameworks?
Yeah, great question. So we've done a lot of work with SOC 2, obviously, like Andy mentioned. That's been sort of our focus for 2021. We are also rolling out additional questions related to ISO 27001 and HIPAA, or HIPAA-related type questions. So the short answer is yes. We're starting with SOC 2, and we're moving towards ISO 27001 and HIPAA, and we plan to add more as customers ask for more.
Actually, this time I don't see any further questions. Well, I guess we can wait another 5 seconds just to make sure nothing else trickles in. I did put in the chat a link to the benchmark and also the Get demo if people want to grab those. Okay, I don't see any further questions. So Andy and Joe, thank you very much for your presentation. That'll conclude today's event.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.